다른 것은 가르쳐 버리는 것은 다 전기 지수다 견주라 제외 제용도 안에 소소야 안에 네바라야라 바시치기리스.
Good evening. So last week we looked at a few verses concluding with looking at when others talk badly about us, whether behind our back or perhaps even directly to us, criticizing us, complaining to or about us. This can damage our reputation, and it can become an obstacle thereby to our gain, our material gain. So not wanting an obstacle to our material gain, when others criticize us, talk badly about us, this being unwanted leads to the mind becoming disturbed and therefore likely to become angry. So we saw there that in circumstances such as this, where our potential gain in terms of reputation or gain as material development, when this is impeded by what others are saying to or about us, we need to remind ourselves that all the material gain we have, or our reputation, or the material gain we hope to accomplish, all of this gets left behind when our life ends. It is not only impermanent, which means it may well be exhausted before our life ends, but certainly when our life ends, it will be left behind. None of it can accompany us. However, what will accompany us is the karma that we have accumulated. Therefore, the way one responds to what others say and do, this is important, because those karmic seeds accumulated, they are what will accompany us for lifetimes to come. And where we have accumulated non-virtue through getting angry, that negative karma will accompany us and be the cause of our suffering in lives to come. So continuing, looking in the same vein, about dealing with our, in this case now, attachment to gain. So how to stop our attachment to what we desire, to what we want to gain. So the 56th verse, it is better I die today than live a long life through wrong livelihood. Even if I live a long life, the suffering of death will be just the same. The first line, it is better I die today. So this is pointing to that our life will end, and when it will end is unknown. It can come at any time. It may well be today, it may be in some days or some weeks, we do not know. It can come at any time. Therefore, with this in mind, we should be guided with how we live our life, understanding that there is a finite period between now and when our life ends. So, how I use what remains of this life is important. So if we use what remains of this life in a way to gather material wealth, power and influence, if that is what's driving us, we are not paying heed to the reality of our situation, which is that death is coming. And therefore, we end up engaging in argument over things which will have, which are of no real importance. They will not, what we are arguing about, will not have an impact beyond this life. But the argument, that certainly will. Likewise, conflict with others in various ways, taking advantage of others, deceiving others, paying or receiving bribes, all of this kind of dishonest behavior so as to get ahead, so as to have a comfortable life, is deceiving ourselves. It's not recognizing that what we are engaging in negativity for is all to be left behind. All of us want happiness. We want to be free of suffering and pain. So this first needs to be recognized, and then from this, independent of all the teachings one's heard, one knows to achieve happiness, there are particular causes to be accomplished, and to avoid suffering, there are particular causes not to be accomplished. So the experience of happiness requires a vast number of causes, and amongst those causes, we need to ensure that we have a certain level of material comfort, of financial security. But we need to be honest with ourselves, with what we realistically need. And what we realistically need, this we should strive to accomplish. But not to be caught up by a desire for abundance and the prestige that comes with that, and the ever greater comfort that may follow from that. There is no need for that. For someone who wants to live a life of meaning, things that are meaningful is where our focus should be. To live a life of meaning requires developing a broad outlook, a spacious mind, a mind that is not obsessed with this life, the accomplishments of this life's pleasures, and the overcoming of this life's problems. Rather, a mind of contentment needs to be developed. If we can accomplish a mind that is content with a realistic level of material comfort and financial security, this inner contentment is a balanced mind. And with this balanced approach, we will be able to not have our mind obsessed by the short-term happiness and problems, but we'll be able to focus on the long term, on lives beyond this. This will free us up in terms of time and mental energy to not have the stresses and pressures of life which tend to lead one to accumulate non-virtue, and rather have time to accomplish virtue. So here, a deep recognition is required that not only can death come at any time, but even if I die poor, doesn't matter. As long as I die with a wealth of virtue, that is a life lived well. So we know from perhaps our own lived experience or in society how much conflict, how many arguments are about money. So this is a reflection of a very short-term attitude and is the opposite of a mind of contentment. So by developing a broader outlook, contrary to a narrow mind focused just on this life, one can also thereby develop an attitude that is comfortable about one's own impending death, that whenever it comes, because I've lived a life of meaning with accomplishing a wealth of virtue, whenever my death comes, I can be relaxed about it. I can welcome it. The second line, but I'll read the first two together. It is better I die today than live a long life through wrong livelihood. So wrong livelihood, to understand it in general, it is where one is focused on achieving materials abundance, material abundance through means that cause harm. Can be engage in arguments over money, taking advantage of others, deceiving others, and so forth. So if one happens to have accumulated the causes to live a long life, but has spent that life accumulating non-virtue, this is deeply harmful. It's not only a waste of opportunity, it is deeply harmful. This term then, wrong livelihood. Livelihood is clear. This is what the means by which one gains material sustenance to look after, to sustain oneself. Being wrong means that one is engaging in one's livelihood under the influence of the afflictions. One is striving for wealth and material comfort at the expense of others. So with minds of attachment dominant, anger is also going to follow. Harm will be caused to others. This, whilst one then may be accumulating material abundance, within one's own mind, deep unhappiness is there. One is competitive with others, distant from others, alone. And through these harmful interactions with others, whilst one may be accomplishing wealth, in a sense one is also accomplishing a great debt. Because these harmful relationships one is forming comes about through the accumulation of non-virtue. And that non-virtue is repaid, in a sense, is repaid through the suffering that will come in the future. So whilst one may be accumulating a vast portfolio of wealth, in fact one is rarely accumulating a debt of suffering. The verse concludes with, even if I live a long life, the suffering of death will be just the same. Our lifespan, our possible lifespan, this is unknown to us. Some have shorter lives, some have longer length, some have very long lives. But all lives that have come about in dependence on karma and afflictions, they will end. And they end in the same way, in the sense of beyond one's control. When the causes for the ending of one's life are gathered, one's life will end. And so whether one has lived a life of great virtue and meaning, or a life of destruction and harm, one's life will end. If one has amassed a vast empire of wealth and power and prestige, or if one's lived a simple life, the end, it is all the same. One's life ends, and it ends due to karma and afflictions. So that this life will end is certain. But when and how, this is not really something within our control. What is also certain is that when this life ends, it is immediately followed by the ongoing process of rebirth. So this life will end, and a new body will be taken. Our continuum will leave this body and proceed on to a new body. This process will continue. And all that we've gathered in this life, the friendships that we value, the wealth that we've amassed, the possessions that we cherish and that hold such sentimental value for us, all of that, entirely, with no exception, will be left behind. We will be accompanied solely by our karmic imprints. The key point then, or a key point to take away here, is that when we recognize that all that we value around us, whether it's relationships, material possessions, will be left behind. What will accompany us is the virtue or non-virtue that we accumulated whilst earning that wealth. When we take this to heart, we'll recognize that what has real value is not our portfolio of wealth, but the portfolio of virtue or non-virtue that we accumulated whilst gathering our fortune. This really needs to be taken to heart, because we'll then come to recognize what is important in our interactions in our daily life, in how we go about our various means in livelihood, and in terms of livelihood, and in terms of interactions with others. And this taking to heart that what is of value is the virtue or non-virtue that we accomplish. This will also aid the development of the mind of contentment. This attitude that is satisfied with what is sufficient. Second line, we have this term, wrong livelihood. So what is wrong is not that one needs to earn a living, to have some form of livelihood. That in itself is not what is wrong. We need to earn a living, but we need to take care in how we earn that living. Because it's how we earn our living that will determine if it's correct or wrong livelihood. And this would refer to looking at two general areas. The common one would be, you could maybe say, field of commerce. And this is quite obvious, that one should not be engaging in stealing and cheating and killing and so forth. So that is quite obvious. But our general field of commerce alone does not determine whether our livelihood is correct or wrong. It really comes down to how we interact with others, or how we do business. Are we interacting with others in a way that is primarily competitive, that wants to take advantage of others, that wants to succeed at all costs, including at bringing harm to others. So this is something to really look at in terms of whether our livelihood is being accomplished in a correct or a wrong manner. And what this comes down to is what one values. If one values wealth, prestige, comfort, pleasure, then it becomes much more likely one will justify taking advantage of others, deceiving others, pushing others aside so that one can get ahead. But if one prioritizes, values the development of inner qualities through the cultivation of virtue, if that is seen as most important, then whether one has an abundance of wealth or just sufficient is not important. What is important then is what qualities one's developing through how one interacts with others. So therefore, our values are what undermines whether we are likely to, at times, engage in wrong livelihood through how we interact with others. So I mentioned in the previous segment that wrong livelihood needs to be understood in two ways. One is the field of work that one engages in, and that's really quite obvious. The subtler way to understand wrong livelihood is how we interact with others. And within this understanding of wrong livelihood, the understanding, or the way to understand wrong livelihood is actually very vast. So for example, if one offers a delicious meal to someone, maybe takes them to a nice restaurant, one may well have a motivation that is included within wrong livelihood, because one is giving them a delicious meal so as to build a relationship with them in order to receive something in return. That would be considered wrong livelihood. The person who is the recipient of the lovely meal, they may also have a motivation that, or an attitude that would be included in wrong livelihood, in that they are particularly effusive in their praise of their host or the person who took them out, and doing so with, in the back of the mind, hoping for a similar invitation again. So this way where we can hint to others or maybe flatter others, this is included within wrong livelihood. So again, what it really comes down to is the way in which we engage with others, hoping for our own self-interest. These are expressions of wrong livelihood. In the process of engaging in Buddhist practice, one looks at one's mind, develops one's mind, comes to know one's mind, comes to know oneself well. So in this particular context then, what one is not being told to do is, if someone shows you kindness, that you don't thank them. We live in society, we need to follow societal norms, and that includes thanking others. And if others thank us, that alone should be no reason for doubt to come about them, about their motivation. Rather, when we thank others, watch our motivation, and thank with sincerity, but without hope to receive something in return. So this is all part of the process of spiritual development, developing one's mind, coming to know oneself, remove the afflictions from our mind, and have the virtuous mind of appreciation or gratitude dominant, as opposed to a mind of self-interest. Now Shantideva in the next two verses presents an illustration on this point. So the first of the two verses, verse 57, having dreamt of experiencing a century of happiness, one person wakes. After experiencing a moment of happiness, another person wakes. Look at the whole verse. Having dreamt of experiencing a century of happiness. So this term, a century of happiness, or the term a century or 100 years, this isn't to be taken literally, but rather as a point of comparison with the third line, a moment. So a century, an expansive period of time, as opposed to just a mere moment in the third line. So it's setting up this point of comparison. So in either case, the first and the third line, one is having a dream, having dreamt of experiencing a century of happiness, as opposed to the third line, after experiencing a moment of happiness. So in both dreams, one is experiencing happiness. Maybe others are praising you, maybe showing respect to you, maybe you're experiencing comfort or wealth, whatever it may be. And it could be for a great duration or just a moment. But in the end, one wakes up, the dream is over, and all that is left is a mere memory and perhaps a pleasant feeling in the mind, and that's it. It's not that if one has a dream where one has accomplished a vast amount of wealth over a whole century, as opposed to how much wealth one can just accomplish in a moment, that one wakes up any richer or poorer. One still has woken, and in reality, one has none of that anyway. So therefore, whether the dream is long or short, whether the wealth is greater or less, one wakes up and it's a mere memory. To be even clearer, if one has, say in the first line, a dream of having a vast impressive house or car, one that people turn their heads to see, or like in the third line, one's house is very modest, one's car is very modest, in the end, when one wakes up, neither car is going to get you anywhere, neither house will provide any shelter. There is no difference between either. The accompanying verse, the 58th, when either person has awoken, their happiness cannot return, whether life has been either long or brief. When death comes, it is consumed just the same. The first two lines. When either person has awoken, their happiness cannot return. So whether one wakes from a dream that is extensive of duration or just fleeting, one wakes with equally nothing. Each dream is of equal insignificance, whether brief or long, whether what one dreamt of is of vast wealth or just modest wealth. When one wakes, they are of equal insignificance. Now the third and fourth line of the 58th verse, which is where the meaning of this illustration in these two verses is presented. Whether life has been either long or brief, when death comes, it is consumed just the same. So that's quite clear, but it's again, the meaning needs to be taken to heart to recognize that whether our life turns out to have been long or brief, in the end, whatever duration the life is, it has passed, and the ending will just be the same. There will be a final exhalation, and one will move on. And again, that is the same, whether a larger expanse of time or a brief expanse of time has passed. Both have merely passed, and now they are over. In the end, whether a life was long or brief, that life is just a memory. And whether the memories of that life, when one is in one's final period, that life is long or short, one still just has nothing more than memories of all that has passed. So this is something to take to heart, to recognize that what we see as so important, these things that trouble us so, or that we yearn for so, to recognize that they are fleeting and have no real value. And in fact, it can be skillful to take presentations such as these and in a sense relate to one's life as if it were like a dream. And there are many levels one can use this analogy, one being that just like in a dream, things appear in a certain way, but in reality, they do not exist in the way that they appear. That's one way. Another way is to recognize that just like a dream is real and vivid whilst one is dreaming, when one wakes, it's a memory, and soon that memory is gone. So too with this life. Everything that has passed is only a memory. But most of what has passed is not even that. It's forgotten. But in the end, it will all be forgotten. So by taking this to heart, we come to recognize the impermanence of this life and the impermanence of all that we yearn for within this life. Our reputation, our prestige, our comfort, our pleasure. All of this is impermanent. It has no real abiding value. This reflection is really helpful in dealing with our attachment for reputation, for prestige, comfort, pleasure, and so forth. Because it's our attachment to things, to material wealth, to our reputation, to pleasurable experiences, that leads us to engage in wrong livelihood. Again, in the broader understanding of the word, afflicted behavior, deceiving others, taking advantage of others, pushing others aside, not valuing the needs of others, but prioritizing ourselves first and foremost. So again, it's our attachment that leads to the plethora of afflictions and the accumulation of non-virtue. And when that attachment is obstructed, anger will arise. And from anger, so much non-virtue is accumulated. So again, through attachment and its accompanying afflictions, an abundance of non-virtue is accumulated. When our attachment is obstructed through that non-virtue, through that anger, again, non-virtue is accumulated. Hence the need to reflect here in the way advised so as to deal with our attachment, so as to challenge what otherwise will be pathways to accumulate extensive non-virtue. The 59th verse. Even if abundant gain is acquired and happily enjoyed for a great length of time, as if robbed by thieves, naked and empty-handed, we will go. The first two lines, as it clearly says, even if abundant gain, and again, gain we can understand in the normal usage as material gain, but also gain in terms of reputation, prestige, and so forth. If abundant gain is acquired and happily enjoyed for a great length of time. If we look at the first two lines, it seems to describe what would generally in society be considered a successful life, even if abundant gain is acquired and happily enjoyed for a great length of time. So this is in society what most people consider a good life. You've lived long, you've been comfortable, wealthy, and you've enjoyed happiness and comfort. Now the third and fourth line. But as if robbed by thieves, naked and empty-handed, we will go. So this is the reality check that we need to take to heart, to recognize that in the end, for everyone, whether the wealthy or the impoverished, they all leave this life the same. Whether as a dying person loses strength, if robbers come and steal everything, or not, everything that they valued so, worked so hard for, gets left behind. And again, whether someone is wealthy, someone has a great reputation, or whether someone is unknown or impoverished, they all leave the same, empty-handed, naked. Where we're being guided in these verses is to recognize where we're being guided is to look at what we value and thereby to see where we are putting our time and our energy. Because here, as we have in the first line in the 59th verse, even if abundant gain is acquired. So again, this is what people in society would consider a life well lived, a successful life, that one has wealth, that one has reputation, and so forth. But here, we are being guided to ask ourselves the question, how was that abundance gained, or that abundance gained? This for us is the crucial question. Not the bank balance, not the wealth, but how was it gained? If it was any of it, or how much of it was gained by means of wrong livelihood, taking advantage of others, pushing others aside, pushing oneself ahead, at the expense of others. As well as then, how much time and energy was consumed by the activity required for this abundant gain to be acquired. And all too often, this is the dominant activity in life. Striving to gather material wealth, to gather pleasurable experiences, and to avoid unpleasant ones. This is the dominant activity in life. And thereby, our time, our mental energy goes into this. And then we look at how a life is lived. So an adult life is lived. So much energy going into gathering material abundance. Then, whilst it's being gathered, worrying about protecting it, worrying that is it going to diminish or is it going to grow? And is someone going to deceive me, cheat me? And then, as one's life is nearing the end, when that's recognized, then there's dealing with possible conflict with others, wanting to get their slice. So this needs to be reflected on. Reflected on how a life lived like this is going to be a life where an abundance of non-virtue is also accumulated. And for what? Because in the end, it will all be left behind. And this points out clearly that what one generally in society one values really has no abiding value. It has no essence. In that, having no abiding value means it will be lost. Whether that's at death, whether it's over the course of one's life in consumption, it has no abiding value because it will be lost. Fundamental meaning of what we've covered in these verses is this is the reflection that turns someone into a spiritual practitioner. Because it's through this reflection that one comes to recognize what has value. One comes to identify what has value. And in this process of identifying what's of value, one will also be looking at how one lives one's life. Is one living a life of distraction or a life of accomplishing what does have abiding value? So this is that foundational reflection whereby we come to identify what is just mere distraction and entertainment, the bright lights that distract us from what has actual value. And what it is that has value is the very causes that lead to happiness and those accompanying techniques that lead to the avoidance of the causes for non-virtue, causes that lead to suffering. So in the particular context of what we've looked at tonight, it needs to be said clearly, we do need to earn a living. We need to be able to sustain our life. But here, what we are being challenged to do is to really look carefully at how we do so, how we earn our living, in particular in terms of how we interact with others, how we relate to others. This is where the focus comes. And this can come about independent on identifying what has abiding value. And we'll recognize thereby it's how we relate to others, how we deal with the afflictions in our mind. This is what has abiding value. So therefore, the outcome of these reflections is that one comes to develop a determined attitude to focus on cultivating virtue within. In terms of engaging in livelihood, this is something that everyone needs to engage in. But in general, the ordained and the non-ordained engage in their livelihood in quite different manners. The ordained are entirely dependent on others for their sustenance, and the non-ordained need to engage in formal employment so as to sustain themselves. But both categories of people, the ordained and the non-ordained, equally need to avoid wrong livelihood in terms of how they interact with others, ensuring that the way they interact with others is, as far as possible, not influenced by their afflictions, but rather influenced by valuing others. So therefore, in terms of wrong livelihood and correct livelihood, this is guided by one's values, by what one values. So therefore, by reflecting on what really has abiding value, this opens oneself to engaging in correct livelihood, particularly again with the understanding of engaging in one's livelihood with an attitude that's cooperative with others, that works with others, not at just one's self-interest. And by engaging in correct livelihood, guided by one's values, as opposed to just falling into a worthwhile profession, by being guided by one's values, one will develop a sense of contentment for one, to have sufficient for one's needs, and not to have a mind that's obsessed with material wealth, so that one can engage in various experiences and pleasures and try and avoid life's insignificant problems, but rather engage in one's livelihood in a manner that enables sufficient mental space and time so that one can cultivate the minds of the Dharma within, cultivate virtue, reflect on future lives, cultivate a motivation of bodhicitta, engage in various virtuous activities such as making offerings to the 3 jewels and so forth. So this comes about, this balanced approach comes about through looking at what has abiding value and what doesn't. What will lead to happiness in this and lives to come, and what will be left behind. So when one reflects in the way guided here, seeing that so much of what obsesses us will be forgotten about later on anyway, and some other things that obsess us, we'll have to leave behind anyway. We'll recognize what has abiding value is solely these imprints on our continuum. With that recognition, one will strive in virtue and to avoid non-virtue. I'd like to say a little more about this term contentment, because it is possible that a misunderstanding can follow. So contentment is an essential quality to develop, because it helps to lessen our attachment and it frees us up to put into what we have come to recognize has value. But within this development of the mind of contentment, be clear to not let it morph into where one is content that oneself is okay, and leave it at that. Because this would be a selfish expression, and that is not the idea here. The purpose of contentment is to lessen our attachment and thereby to give us more time and space to engage in the cultivation of the mind or the Dharma, not to sit back content with what I have done and that I'm okay. I have looked after myself, my family, my community, myself and my family, and now you think I've done enough. That is a self-satisfied, a self-centered misunderstanding of contentment. So when one has developed an attitude of contentment, one will be easily content with what is sufficient and what is realistically sufficient. But then one will utilize the abundance of time and energy you have to cultivate the Dharma and to express the Dharma that one is cultivating, and you express that Dharma in terms of bettering one's community, helping in society, helping one's community. This then is a general expression of a content attitude. I have sufficient, I'm okay, therefore I can freely give of myself. And within this then, giving of oneself, one does so without the attitudes that can be associated with wrong livelihood, hoping to get something in return and so forth. So this is now a further point, that when we are engaging in beneficial activities, watch for these afflicted attitudes that can distort one's motivation. So for Bodhisattvas, this is something they watch closely. So in other contexts, we talk about the 8 worldly concerns, but these are the attitudes Bodhisattvas too are on guard against. Bodhisattva will express themselves, express their inner qualities to bring benefit to others, but they'll make sure that there's not self-interest there, wanting, for example, a good reputation, guarding the mind from justifying a desire for good reputation to be of benefit to others, but rather to be guided solely by the wish, I want to ease the suffering of others. This isn't about me, it's about benefiting others. So for ourselves, we should guard against the wish to be liked, to be thanked, to do, and it's within their capacity, not because of what others will say about them. So for ourselves, I encourage you to slowly develop this attitude of contentment, then utilize that attitude of contentment to engage in the cultivation of what does have abiding value, the minds of the Dharma within, and to express those minds of the Dharma in terms of helping in one's community, being of benefit in society. Giving of oneself, and doing so as free of self-interest as one can. Then thank you, and we can conclude there for tonight. Thank you.